Good evening and welcome to the final Q&A for 2015. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the Chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, Tasneem Chopra, Environment Minister Greg Hunt, who will soon represent Australia at climate talks in Paris, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and former Middle East correspondent Geraldine Brooks, the former Finance Minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, Shadow Infrastructure Minister Anthony Albanese, and businesswoman and economist Judith Sloan. Please welcome our panel. As always, there is a lot to talk about and only one more hour to do it. Let's go to our very first questions from Zarvan Jizmedian.
Thank you, Tony. My question is this. How can we stop the Islamic State once and for all? I mean, is bombing from the air enough, or do we need to send an army troops to Syria and Iraq to finish the job?
Greg Hunt, let's start with you.
Look, I don't think that putting troops on the ground in the form of an expeditionary force is something that would ultimately be sustainable. I think that in many ways that's what Islamic State wants. For myself, I think there are two fundamentals. One is security and a tough-minded approach to security both domestically and internationally, and that means cooperation of a group of nations. It does mean hard military action, but then there also has to be cohesion, and that's cohesion at home where we work across different groups as a single nation to try to provide people with the best option, and ultimately cohesion abroad. It's not going to be easy in Syria. It's not going to happen overnight. There has to be a degrading of Islamic State, but ultimately I think that the only long-term solution there involves a political solution of sorts. But first there has to be and I'm sorry to say this, a very tough military approach using the best of the strength that we have. In many ways, like we did with Al-Qaeda, which transformed and degraded and ultimately undermined much of their capacity.
Does there also have to be cohesion in government ranks? Because former Prime Minister Tony Abbott recently emerged to say Islamic State can't be contained, has to be destroyed by military force, and he declared Australia should do more to defeat the toxin at its source.
Look,
was that helpful?
I don't think it's an issue either way. I think he is absolutely, as a former Prime Minister, entitled to present views. But Australia, the United States, Germany, the UK, all have a very similar view that this is a deep military threat, both within our own societies and, of course, in the Middle East. Therefore, in terms of Syria, there has to be tough action across the border and from the air. But in my view, sending an expeditionary force onto the ground would ultimately be a quagmire. But having said that, we have had very significant success beyond what people might have imagined in September 2001 in dealing with Al-Qaeda. And so that same template, but with much more community cohesion at home and abroad, is the best solution in an imperfect situation.
Anthony Albanese, Al-Qaeda was defeated in Afghanistan, if we could put it that way, by troops on the ground. And the questioner is asking, is that what needs to happen in Syria?
Well, I think one of the things that you wouldn't want is politicians making decisions based upon what the best military strategy is. I think you would listen to the defence experts, and if I was on the National Security Committee of the Cabinet again, that's what I'd be doing. There is no doubt that this scourge needs to be defeated. There is no doubt also that there is no role, in my view, for the Islamic State or any of its people in the future of Syria or Iraq. You can't have an attitude of just bringing them in. But also, of course, you need to work out what the end game is. And the end game has to involve the Syrian people, all of the groups there. I think we're seeing gradually the world creep towards acknowledging that the idea that you get rid of Assad without knowing what will replace that regime is perhaps not the greatest strategy of all.
So you'd argue you need to keep the dictator in place, would you, in order to defeat ISIS?
No.
Is that what you're suggesting?
What I suggest is that it's not up to you or I sitting in the comfort of a studio in Sydney to determine what the best solution is for Syria. That is a solution for the Syrian people.
Well, I think you just determined that you couldn't get rid of Assad easily without leaving a vacuum, isn't that
Well,
right?
you need to make sure that you talk about what the peace looks like. Now, in Iraq, when the Baathists were all gotten rid of, playing a role in the future state, that created major problems in itself. So you need to talk about what the solution would look like, as well as, and then it's more possible to work out how you can get there.
Yanis Varoufakis.
Have you noticed how after an atrocity like what happened in Paris, the next morning everybody seems to know what the solution is and what the parameters of the problems are, when we really don't know? It would be a good start to acknowledge the depth of our ignorance and to start building up the pieces of knowledge that we do have. One of the things we do know is that the kind of knee-jerk reaction that followed 9/11 causes more problems than it solves. Another thing we know is that...
Are you talking about the invasion of Afghanistan or the invasion of Iraq, or both of those?
Well, I'm of course referring to the invasion of Iraq.
The immediate reaction was the invasion of Afghanistan.
Well, but you mentioned the defeat of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a very small group of fighters. We may have defeated, speaking from the perspective of the West, Al-Qaeda, but we lost Afghanistan. At the moment, Afghanistan is a quagmire. The Taliban, who were the reason why Al-Qaeda was there, are now going from strength to strength. This was not a victory. Every knee-jerk reaction that has followed an atrocity has led to a deepening of the troubles from which, in the end, our own societies are suffering, untold hardship and disintegration. But let me just make one small point. There is much we don't know. But what I do know, and I speak for myself, is that the sight of a Western leadership at once discussing war on ISIS and the potential of invading with ground troops and bombing, while at the same time doing absolutely nothing to stop the flood of financing from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to the very same thugs that have attacked us in Paris, in Beirut, and elsewhere. That, to me, smacks of hypocrisy and yet another potential debacle, fiasco for the Western powers and democracies.
I'm going to go to another question before I bring in the other panellists. It's on a similar line. It's from Hannah Post.
In the wake of the Paris atrocities, the French government has promised to increase presence and military intervention within Syria. I was wondering, Geraldine Brooks, do you believe the Australian government should step up the military operations in Syria as a means of counter-operating terrorism spreading to Western countries such as Australia? Or do you believe there's an alternate solution to counter-operate this extremist ideology?
Geraldine.
Yeah, I think that the question that we need to ask is, it's very natural after the kinds of atrocities we've seen not just in Paris last week, also in Beirut, also with the downing of a jet full of people on vacation in the Sinai. It's natural to want the hot satisfactions of revenge. It's natural to want to see a government act. But I think that you should ask a personal question. I always ask myself, would I want my son or daughter to go and fight in that war? And if the answer to that is no, then why would I send somebody else's kid? And if the answer is yes, that this is so evil and so existential that I would be prepared to see my son go, then let's have conscription and let's be all in. I think it's been very corrupt what we've been doing for the past 15 years, which is putting the burden on a very small group of young men and women while the rest of us just go shopping. And I think that's why it hasn't been effective. You can't do that to people. You can't have a small part of the population bearing the entire burden.
Geraldine, you just heard Yanis Varoufakis point the finger at financing from Saudi Arabia. You spent a fair bit of time in that part of the world. I mean, do you think that's also part of the problem?
I did. I've been thrown out of Saudi Arabia twice and proud of it.
Naturally, a woman journalist, what would you expect?
No, I actually think that Yanis is absolutely right. And it's not just the financing. It is the flow of ideology which has been unchecked for decades. We have sat by while Wahhabis have spread the most unconscionable, airless, hate-filled, misogynistic, homophobic teachings branded as Islamic through madrasas and mosques all over Southeast Asia, all over Europe. We've spent trillions on bombs. I think it's time to start spending trillions on schools. If we had started 30 years ago, when the Saudis did, building schools which are much cheaper than fighter jets, we would now have a young coterie in what is a very young part of the world, young, hungry minds who would have learned our humanistic values, who would have learned about pluralism and democracy, but we didn't do that. We've gone for the military option every time.
Tasneem Chopra, two questions to reflect on, both similar, but and you can reflect also if you on what our other panellists have been saying, particularly what Geraldine just said about the exporting of extremism.
Well, I think just to make things clear, I mean, we have these atrocities that are happening in the name of Islam, but have got no legitimacy from Islamic leaders across the world, including Australia. So the condemnations have been consistent and they have been overwhelming. Secondly, we have to ask ourselves then, once condemnations are made and they're given repeatedly, when the Muslim community attempts to progress the conversation from condemnation to, why are these things happening? What can we do about it? There tends to be almost a response from the mainstream of, stick to your lane. You shouldn't be discussing this issue. And I think Muslims need to be part of the solution here, because let's face it, the overwhelming majority of victims of terrorism and of Islamic State have been Muslims. In that region, the displacement of 4 million Syrians into Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, just in the recent few years, and then those coming into Europe are overwhelmingly Muslim. ISIS blew up a mosque last week. If you're a Muslim with a different viewpoint, if you're a woman, if you're a Muslim minority, or if you're a non-Muslim, you're fair game. So these are the realities of what we're trying to contend with as a community. And then when you're a Muslim in the West and you're painted with the same brush as being part of this organisation that's inherently evil, it leaves you with very little wiggle room when you then decide to want to be part of the solution or discussion about what can happen. So do I think there's an ideology problem? Obviously there is. As for the military intervention, I take on board what Yanis has also said. The financing of these issues, we have to be quite open and upfront about who we're backing and who we're supporting, and then claiming where our allegiances are. So there's a lot of duplicity that has to be negotiated. But inherently, where do we go from here? We know that unity and resilience within a community will completely destabilise what ISIS is trying to do. They want to see us broken and they want to see friction. They don't want to see Muslims in the West succeeding. They want to see an apocalyptic end to a base, or a clash of civilizations really between the two. And nothing's going to fuel that more than divisive rhetoric, policy and right-wing pundits.
All right, quite a few points set up there. And we've got some other questions which we'll address them directly. The next one is a video. It's from Michael Doran in Yarra Junction, Victoria.
My daughter Sophie lives in Paris, and she was at the Bacalan concert when the attacks occurred. Her friend standing next to her was shot, and they lay on the floor pretending to be dead amidst the carnage until they were later rescued. She is now trying to rebuild her life, and I've been saddened by many things. But I'm equally saddened by the responses from our leaders, both political and Islamic, who seem to lack any vision for what we can do to stop these types of attacks occurring here. The aim of these attacks is to provoke fear. And indeed they have provoked me, but not to be afraid, but rather to speak out and to do what I can to build a stronger and better Australia, and one that can withstand the hatred being directed at us for the way we live and our way of life. My question is, what is done when we select the people to come and settle in this country to ensure that they have a clear understanding of the values and norms here, and that although this is a beautiful country, these values may be different to those that they're accustomed to, and will indeed be different to the Islamic society they have left behind.
Judith, Sloan, I neglected you in those last questions. I'll come back to you to start with that one.
Look, you know, I think it's a really important point that he makes, and Geraldine, it probably is right to personalise about, do we want our son or daughter to be going off to fight this war, but do we want our son or daughter to be at a concert and absolutely senselessly slaughtered? You know, so I can understand why people are reacting, and I mean, I agree with you, Anthony, that you know, it's really basically impossible from a sort of a non-professional, non-military point of view to know quite what to do. But I think at the end of the day, this is going to be a multifactorial solution, and it is going to involve trying to do something with the financial links. You know, we really should be able to do that. I mean, you can trace that sort of thing. It's got also probably something to do. I mean, Australia's not going to do anything on its own. I mean, this is all about a coalition arrangement. So we will be guided by that. I think that will probably, there will be a change in the rules of engagement in respect of the bombing, for example. I think that is pretty likely. And there may be some special services forces that go in. But at the same time, there are, I think, a lot of other things that need to be done. I think that the trouble is, it's, you know, we see these young people there. I mean, and we were talking about this in the green room, that, you know, when I was 15, I was wondering what, you know, Mum was going to cook for tea. Whereas, like, these are 15-year-olds who are prepared to lay down their lives for a cause. You know, it's very hard, I think, for us to understand.
Yeah, Anthony Albanese, we'll pick up on the question. The idea implicit in that question was that people from Islamic societies have different values.
Well, I don't think that is necessarily the case. And I look at Australia and I think one thing that we can be is a bit of a microcosm for the world. I represent an electorate where 42% of people speak a language other than English at home, where people of different faiths, including I have a very large Muslim Alawi population with connections to Syria. I have Sunnis, Shiites, Christians, Jewish, Hindus, the full lot, and they all get on. They all get on. I mean, I often say, with regard to I have the Cyprus Club in my electorate, one of the best things that happens is Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots getting together, sharing each other's, it's a pretty common culture, you know, some people call it Greek coffee, some people call it Turkish coffee, Christian, Islamic, but essentially we have so much more in common than what divides us. And one of the things that we can do, the future of Syria is quite complex, and I think we're all agreed that none of us have the ideal solution, but we can as a nation show, I think, the world the success of multiculturalism and the success of harmony, and refuse to be divided here as a nation.
Yanis, the question of who comes to Western countries from the huge tide of Syrian refugees became a sort of burning issue in Europe when a Syrian passport was found by the body of one of the suicide bombers in Paris, and it turned out that person had come to Europe via Greece. You'd be obviously aware of the debate that's going on there. How do you think that reflects on the debate we're seeing in Australia?
Well, there's no doubt that when you have a massive exodus of refugees, there may very well be a couple of insurgents that infiltrate. But it's neither here nor there. Both the terrorist attacks and the refugee influx are symptoms of the same problem. But one doesn't cause the other. We should not, there's a correlation, but there's no causation. Let me put it very simply. The vast majority of the people who explode bombs and blow themselves up and take up AK-47s and mow people down, they're people who were born in France, in Belgium. Think of the bombings in London. Britain doesn't have free movement. It's not part of the Schengen Treaty. So the notion that we're going to overcome this problem by erecting fences, electrifying them, and shooting people who try to scale them, this plays into their hand. The only people who profit from that are the traffickers, because the price for trafficking goes up, the economic rents increase, and ISIS. They are the only beneficiaries. And let me just add, from a Greek perspective, one vignette, which I think is important. When you have 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 people being washed up on your shores, on the Aegean Islands, every day, In a nation, by the way, which is buffeted by a Great Depression, where families on those islands in particular are finding it very hard to put food on the table for their children that night. And these people, in their crushing majority, I'm proud to report, opened their doors to those wretched refugees. The thought that comes to my mind is very simple. If somebody knocks on your door at 3 in the morning and they're wet, they are bleeding, they've been shot at, they're frightened, what do? I think that there's only one answer. You open the door and you give them shelter, independently of a cost-benefit analysis, independently of the chance that they may harm you, independently of the idea about values. Values are fungible. We create them. The nation-state is a very recent phenomenon in Europe. We all lived as part of great empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire for that matter. So we have to learn how to fashion these values without being victims of the fear that breeds greater misanthropy and greater danger for our people in Australia, in Britain, in France, in Syria.
Tasneem, you would have heard the central message of that video question was essentially about whether or not people in Islamic countries coming to Australia have different values before they get here, and whether there needs to be an effort to change those values.
No, I think that's a time-old argument that we've been hearing for the last 20 years, and it's a convenient political point scorer, but I think in reality it amounts to very little, because the values are inherently the same. If you're talking about Judeo-Christian values and Abrahamic faith traditions, it's very, very similar. But I echo pretty much everything Yanis has said there. But I would add, when we're looking at the Paris incident in particular, you'll notice that, I mean, the world media has really got on board with this, the tragedy of it, the horror of it, the randomness of it. It shocked us all. But when we view the issue and the conversation ensuing on terrorism purely through the Paris prism, we are forgetting the fact that there were days before that, an attack in Beirut. There was the downing of the Egypt Air plane over Russia, the deaths in Nigeria, the deaths today in Mali, and of course the 147 Kenyan students who were killed in Garissa University. These are all victims of terror. These are all victims who require our response and reaction, but don't get the same attention. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, when you view this conversation on the victims of terror through the prism of Paris, what you're neglecting is that the majority of the victims of terror, the majority of those on the ground who are fighting terror, are Muslims, and a lot of them are refugees. And those refugees who are wanting to leave, who are trying to escape those very horrors that we have seen affecting people in Paris and in West, in New York, are realities that we need to say, well, what are we going to do about that? I know that since 1976, there have been 70,000 asylum seekers settled in Australia who arrived by boat. Not one of them has been found to have a link to terrorism. So the statistics speak for themselves, and we know that, while 31 governor states in America have put up their hands and said no one's coming through our borders, President Obama has actually called that out as being a highly un-American issue. So, there's some conflicting messages with leadership.
Tasneem, how do you then confront, and how does, let's say, the Muslim community in Australia confront the idea that those young men and women who blew themselves up, who murdered innocent civilians, were acting on the instructions of people who took their cues from a perverted version of Islam?
It's a war of ideology, and how to grapple with that when those particular young individuals, we know, particularly with the perpetrator of Paris, we know that from his family, he wasn't someone who went to the mosque, went to the local community. He was a drug runner operating from his pub. So not your quintessential Muslim type of character by any stretch of the imagination. So then how to access those people becomes a question that we are grappling with too. So to then conflate those characteristics with the community is completely disingenuous.
Greg Hunt.
Look, I think one of the big questions here, which comes from Michael's original issue, is what is Australia? And my view is that when you look around the world, it is arguably as successful, if not the most successful, multicultural society anywhere. And what does that mean? It means that we have been able to draw people from around the world and bring of them their best selves. And that's drawing people, whether it's from Islamic society, from Greek society, from all of the different races, religions, ethnicities. And that's the genius of modern Australia. Yes, it's imperfect, and we see issues that break out. But that's why I would respectfully but categorically reject the idea that in some way there should be a prohibition or there's a values conflict with those who are coming from different faiths or religions, no matter where they are. What we always have to do is look to see who is marginalised, and that can be within a particular community, and obviously it's often, as Tasneem says, those that are not necessarily practitioners of the faith but on the edges right around the world, particularly young men who need to be addressed. And then secondly, reaching out and embracing the community and the communities. That's the only way, and that's the genius of Australia over the last 200 years.
Geraldine, looking at this from now a distance as an expat, I mean, how does it look?
Well, I agree. I think we do this really well, and I think we should have a lot of confidence in our ability to do it. And I look at my own family, who are 99.9% Irish immigrants back when, and, you know, they probably didn't share what we would consider Australian values when they got here. I know that my great-grandmother hated Protestants. You know, they used to actually stone each other in the streets of Burwa. But their daughter, my mother, did not have those values at all. So, look, give them a minute. They might not have Australian values the day they step off the boat, but have some confidence in what we've built here and how attractive it is and how people want to be a part of it and they become a part of it. And that's why this country is so great. I think we all agree that we've really got something, not perfect, but really wonderful here.
OK, you're watching the final Q&A of 2015. Stick around for our end of the year song from Sammy J and Randy. Our next question comes from Jana Quinlan.
There's been a great deal of discussion recently about how best to deal with the rise of religious extremism in Australia. Yet after seeing footage of the Reclaim Australia rallies yesterday, in which protesters were arrested for assaulting a police horse, for illegally possessing weapons and bomb-making materials, and for graffitiing on a monument, how do we deal with the rise of violent racist extremism as demonstrated by Reclaim Australia and the United Patriots Front?
Yanis, I'll start with you because you've also dealt with this issue. In fact, you've got an extremist group, we could say, Golden Dawn, now have a serious toehold in politics.
They are the third largest
mainstream
party.
Politics.
I would sit in my ministerial place in Parliament and there they would be in front of me. A group of Nazi thugs elected democratically. There can be no worse nightmare than that. So how do you deal with that? Well, you should never dilute democracy. You should never turn into them by denying them democratic rights. You should always lead with the ideas of democracy, of liberalism, of socialism, if you are that way inclined. But you should never respond to barbarism barbarically, because then you feed it.
Anthony Albanese.
Well, I saw that footage as well, and it was, you know, sometimes our citizens do things that embarrass us as a nation. That was not Australia at its best. That was Australia at its worst, as were the Cronulla incidents of a few years ago. But we shouldn't imagine that, and we shouldn't uplift it by talking about that as a significant viewpoint, because I don't believe that it is. I believe overwhelmingly that Australians are tolerant, that Australians reject racism, and every time you go into a local school in particular, I think in any part of Australia, you just see people learning different languages. You know, my son learnt Mandarin at the local public school, and people engaging and really being enriched by the variations of the cultures that exist. So, yes, there will be a minority who preach hate, but hate, you know, as Martin Luther King said, it corrodes the personality and distorts the soul. And it damages the hater more than the hated. And, you know, we just need to rise above it as a nation.
Judith Sloan.
Well, I mean, we do have to respect their right to express an opinion. I think that's really, really important. but we don't have to tolerate violence. I'm personally very unhappy with the idea that someone would attend a demonstration to express their points of view and then be covered up in some sort of, mask and disguising their identity. That I don't think is Australian, shall I say it. Whether this kind of thing could be handled better, or whether the groups who I think also legitimately have a point of view might stay away, that I think actually would, in a sense, make the Reclaim Australia demonstrations a lot less newsworthy, and we probably would find that there's quite sparsely attended, as a matter of fact. But for some reason, the groups with the opposing points of view always seem to want to turn up, and I don't think that's a help. But I do think it's, in all this, I think it's a worrying time, but we do have to stand up for those sort of basic freedoms, and one of them is the freedom to express your point of view.
Tasneem.
Yes, okay.
So do those basic freedoms include the freedom to hate Islam, for example?
Freedom of speech obviously does have its parameters. Obviously, when you cross the line and you border onto the point of vilifying and causing, violently threatening people, which has been the reality for Australian Muslims in the last several years. And I just want to point out that we've seen a proliferation of these right-wing extremist groups in this country, particularly since Abbott leadership, and that's the fact. We've had the emergence of the UPF, the ADL, Reclaim Australia, Rise Up Australia, to an extent that we've not seen with previous governments. That is a reality, and we know that because as an Australian Muslim, you are suddenly in the spotlight, receiving hate mail, whatnot.
You're not equating extremism with Tony Abbott's leadership, are you?
No, but I'm saying...
So what's the connection?
I'm saying the emergence of those groups during his leadership is something that we need to discuss. I think that does happen, and you have to ask yourself, well, it didn't happen before, and certainly there were...
What do you think is going on?
There were messages. There was subliminal messages. We know that George Christensen attended an anti-immigration rally in Queensland. The kind of divisive us and them language that was used under the previous leadership as well. These all fed into a sentiment that the Australian Muslim was the other, and the rest of us were the us. And as long as you continue to have that divide, and I know that Andrew McLeod sat here on the panel last week and clearly said Australian Muslims need to be seen to be part of the us, and them is the ISIS. But when you make Muslims and ISIS part of the same team, this is highly problematic. And when the proliferation of these groups occurs, the entity most delighted with the outcome of this is in fact ISIS. Because when you have language, when you use divisive terms, when you say refugees aren't welcome, we need to put a tracker on the Mufti, we need to stop immigration from Muslim countries, and these kinds of very directly hurtful things. The formation of a political party, the ALA, the Australian Liberty Alliance, premised on anti-Muslim immigration. It sends a very strong message to Australian Muslims that, your location in this country is highly negotiable. So it's unsettling.
Greg Hunt, now I'm sure you want to respond to elements of that.
Sure, look, my view is you have to reject the extreme on either side, whether it is from the racist perspective or from the extremist who's advocating a caliphate. Neither of them have a place here, but the answer to it, other than when it steps over to the pure security issue when it does become a matter for police and intelligence, the answer to it is to advocate and extend the hand for liberalism, for broad stream acceptance of differences. That goes back to my point about the best of Australia. And yes, Anthony's right. What we saw yesterday was the dark side of the community, but it is not representative of the overall Australia. So do I think that, there are downsides? Absolutely. Do I think that as a global example of multiculturalism, we do it pretty much better than almost anybody else.
Okay, what about the point that Tasneem just made about the previous government, about the us and them language, as she put it, coming from mainstream politicians? Has that changed? Is it something from the past now that you have a different leader?
I respectfully don't accept the starting
Team
proposition.
Australia was the term that came to my mind.
But, I do say this, that of course each Prime Minister brings a different approach. Malcolm Turnbull's approach is a very embracing one. He has deliberately spent time with as many different parts of the community as possible, and he has chosen his words very, very carefully, but in a heartfelt way of reaching out. And so that's what we are consciously, deliberately and sincerely attempting to do.
Are you saying now as opposed to then?
Look, it's a different emphasis from a different Prime Minister.
Tasneem, what did you jump in?
I was going to say, I mean, definitely the language has been more measured by Minister Turnbull, I would agree. But then we're still getting the comments from the likes of Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton in recent weeks relating even to the post-Paris incident about, well, we need to select refugees based on their faith and Christian ones might be given preference, etc. We know that with the Melton rally on the weekend, in the days leading up to it, an individual from the Reclaim Australia mob was found to have possessed weapons and bomb-making material. Now, he wasn't arrested on terror charges, interestingly, but I suspect if he had been from another group, he might have been.
One of the things that Tasneem and I actually discussed before coming on air was of jointly going out and meeting with young people in some of the suburbs of Melbourne from the Islamic community, working with them jointly, and we will do that sometime after Parliament goes down and before Christmas. And you know, to have somebody like this who can bridge some of the divides and gaps, I think is a very valuable part of this program, and it gives us a chance as parliamentary representatives to broaden and to be part of a community that perhaps feels under stress.
All right, it's time to move on to... sorry,
yes. One
yes.
small point, and picking up on something Anthony said about the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, along those lines. My personal strategy regarding fighting bigotry is to concentrate on my own community, on my own people, the problems within our communities, on the understanding, on the assumption, if you want. But I think it's a correct perspective, that there is a lot more diversity within our communities than differences between our communities. The disagreements that I have with other Greeks are much more powerful, let's say, than the disagreements that I have with the average German, the average Australian, the average Muslim, the average American. Instead of pointing fingers across community divides or lines, it is important to take responsibility for our own communities, for our own people. So, for instance, when it comes to the Cypriot issue, I'm much more eager to concentrate my criticism, my slings and arrows, on the intolerance that I see amongst the Greek side of the divide than to do that by pointing fingers on the other side. And I think that this is a strategy that could work if all of us adopted it.
All right, we've got a question which is related to the not-so-typical Germans that you had a connection to when you were Finance Minister. Before that, if you have any doubtful claims on Q&A, send a tweet using the hashtags #FactCheckingQuandra, and keep an eye on our Twitter account for fact checks by The Conversation or the ABC fact-checking unit. Now, our next question, as I just forecast, comes from Gail Bromberger.
Yanis, you've spoken of the extreme difficulty you faced as Finance Minister of Greece, dealing with members of the Eurogroup, that, to crudely paraphrase, when you proffered economic arguments, the response was such that you might as well have sung the Swedish national anthem. Economic illiteracy, or perhaps even willful ignorance of economics, dominates many facets of life of the average voter. Do you see any hope for the electorate to ever have a rational and meaningful understanding on the whole of important economic matters when they enter the voting booth? Or will less substantive talk lines continue to dominate political outcomes and decision-making?
Yanis.
Excellent question. But the preface is just a description of a uniquely European phenomenon. We've created the largest and most substantial and significant social economy in the world, the Eurozone, and created at the same time absolutely no legitimate, functional, efficient system of governing that economic area. You only need, the Eurogroup is a bit like a sausage. If you know what's in it, you don't want to touch it with a barge pole. It is utterly dysfunctional. And this is not coming just from me. I'm a whistleblower if you want, because I'm not in there anymore. But I can assure you that there's a very strong consensus amongst all the participants in it, even people that I had great disagreements with, that the Eurozone is the way that we have structured it is absolutely ungovernable. And that explains why it remains in the clasps of a terrible deflation, which has terrible repercussions for Australia as well. But that's another longer discussion, another program that will never happen. But regarding your question, this is, if you want, we're going back to Plato's lack of faith in the capacity of the demos, of the people, to grapple with important points. Plato, let me remind you, was an anti-democrat. He did not believe that democracy was a sound system for making decisions of importance, especially decisions that connected to technical issues. Now, my view coincides with that of a great conservative, and I'm saying this as a left-winger, Winston Churchill, that democracy indeed is a terrible system, but it is absolutely the best of all alternatives. And when you don't have it, you end up making technocratic decisions, decisions that affect technical issues, like interest rates, like whether we should have a common bond in the Eurozone or not. You end up making those without the democratic process in a way that fails from an economic efficiency point of view. And you end up with a crisis which then requires even more political authoritarianism in order to stabilize it. And then you enter a never-ending spiral of more authoritarianism, less democracy, greater economic inefficiency and failure.
Yanis,
that is Europe.
Yeah, can I would love to have been in the room when you were saying these kind of things to the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, who it is said that you drove to the edge of insanity.
But he never said that. He never said that.
He didn't say that. That's been written about you.
You see, there's a magnificent disconnect between that which Wolfgang Schäuble said to me and that which the international press was reporting that he said to me. I can assure you, and we're here, we will be here around the next few days. Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble can choose to deny what I'm saying, but he agrees with me. He agrees with me, he wouldn't put it in those colorful words, but he agrees with me that the Eurogroup is not an apt mechanism, institution for governing the European Union.
We've got another economist on the panel. We might as well throw to Judith and
Where
get her
we
opinion on
disagree,
this.
let me just add this before Professor Sloan comes in.
You do need to finish that point.
No, where Wolfgang and I disagreed was on what needed to replace it, on what kind of political union we needed to graft upon the existing monetary union in order to stabilize the monetary union and return a modicum of democratic process that would lead Europeans to see their own institutions against as legitimate and to actually live in an economy that functions a lot better than it does at the moment.
Judith.
I mean, I think it's really interesting in Australia that we are, I think, a very economically literate population. If you go overseas...
You thank Paul Keating for that, by the way?
Yeah, well, you go overseas and the newspapers have very little economics in it, but our newspapers tend to have a tremendous amount. And, I think sometimes we forget to acknowledge the achievements. I mean, in the early 1970s, we were about the 20th country in terms of per capita income. We're now the 5th. This was a dramatic improvement. And it was a really big series of economic reforms, particularly the Hawke-Keating, which, Anthony, you seem to have turned your back on, but that era, I think was amazing. And they prosecuted things that were, I think, on the face of it, basically unpopular. So cutting tariffs, it's a really hard argument to win. Privatising the Commonwealth Bank, Telstra, Qantas and the like, people, I think's instincts are actually against those sorts of things. Deregulating the financial sector. And I think that the amazing thing is that it was a democratic process, Yanis, and I think that was the exciting thing. The population was brought along for the ride.
Well, yes, you can.
Perhaps respond.
Since you turned your back on Paul Keating and Bob Hawke and
the whole
John Howard.
Yes, you can. Briefly, though.
Judith's latest sledge. The fact is that the economic model worked because it was economic reform, not just with the bottom line, the top line in terms of economic growth. It was economic reform to achieve social outcomes, to lift up the standard of living of the population through the social wage, by introducing Medicare, opposed by the Conservatives, gotten rid of by the Fraser government, by introducing increased wages, real wage increases occurred, by increasing employment, diversifying the economy. It was a whole economic strategy, but with a purpose, not just for the top end of town, but for the mass of the people. That's why Hawke Keating's legacy is so important. That's why it's a fundamental tenet of Labor's proud history.
Can I just quickly bring Yanis in on this, because you were an economics professor in Australia. You obviously know all about this. So how do you feel about that as a socialist yourself? Here was a socialist government basically introducing major free market reforms to change the nature of the country. Is that the way to go, and is that where Greece failed, essentially?
The market is a magnificent instrument, and it must be used judiciously in order to complete an overall plan for how you're going to manage your economy. This is how the United States became great. This is how Australia became a substantial country. You have to pass judgment on Hawke Keating in the context, however, of a broader perspective. It wasn't just the deregulation. There was also the Accord, which was intricately linked with that, which was a failure, a catastrophic failure. Now we can go into this. So, if you want me to answer just very succinctly, the reforms that were mentioned were essential. At least the basic ones about tariffs and in terms of deregulating a large number of markets. Australia had a long social democratic tradition, which the Liberals and the Nationals bought into at some point, and I think that was very important for the kind of consensus building in this country, which, in combination with these reforms, produced decent outcomes. In the case of Greece, you are quite right. We failed spectacularly to produce the reforms that would end many of the malignancies of the Greek social economy. But let me add just another point, which is quite important for the context. We chose to embed ourselves, left and right, into a European Union that was designed in such a way that, at first, it would effect a large transfer of capital to Greece, allowing us degrees of freedom that we didn't really need.
To become massively indebted, in other words.
To become massively indebted. You have got to remember that when Greece entered the European Union, we had the lowest degree of debt, private and public, in Europe. But this is what happens when you enter a single market without a single polity, the lack of democracy that you mentioned before. Okay. One last point about Australia.
Keep it quick, because we've got to move on.
I agree that Australians are literate, and of course they are the best judges of the efficacy and wisdom of economic policies, not the experts. Where Australia has been let down, in my estimation, of observing over the last 2-3 decades, is by its politicians. Australians in Australia show amazing skills and dexterity. Australians abroad, wherever you go abroad, whether it's in the arts, in the movie industry, in the sciences, you find astonishing Australians that have contributed massively to world culture and science. Australian governments have always been punching below their weight relatively to the rest of Australia. The last Prime Minister that was impressive was Paul Keating. Malcolm Turnbull has a great opportunity. He has the right instinct, but can he carry the Liberal Party with him?
We'll come back to that point. It's time to move along. Next question comes from Susan Tay.
Thank you. Can you assure us that Australia will be working alongside other developed nations in its climate change policies? Is there room to move in the direct action policy to turn it into a trading scheme if it does not meet required targets without upsetting the more conservative members of the Liberal Party?
Greg Hunt, obviously a question for you on your way to Paris.
I was guessing that was the case. Look, I think, thank you very much. Firstly, yes, we will work with other countries, and in fact, I've just returned from the pre-Paris meeting, and as part of that, there was a meeting of the Montreal Protocol, which was about the ozone-depleting gases. Australia was one of two countries that was selected unanimously by 197 to lead those talks. We brokered a deal which helped save about 90 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions between now and 2050. To put that in context, that's as if the world produced no emissions for 2 entire years. And that was an Australian initiative, an Australian leadership on our watch, in our time, only a couple of weeks ago. At Paris, we go with the desire and the commitment to have a genuine global agreement. And we were one of 2 countries that was applauded at the pre-Paris meeting for the sense of energy that we brought to the talks and the willingness to try to broker compromises. On the targets, later this week we'll be releasing our update on our progress towards our 2020 targets, and look, I can say tonight what that will show is that we are sub-zero. In other words, 5 years out, we're already on track to meet and beat officially our 2020 targets, and that means we will have done it the first time for the first Kyoto period. We'll do it now for the second, and then we'll go forwards with a genuine and very ambitious approach for the third round out to 2030.
Okay, I've got to ask you this obvious question. Are you going to go to Paris as some kind of disciple for direct action policies instead of the carbon trading schemes which most countries have adopted?
Well, actually, let me again challenge the presumption that you make there. The World Bank has just adopted a model largely drawn from the Australian reverse auction. It's called a pilot auction facility. We see in South Africa and Brazil reverse auctions in relation to renewable energy.
And we see China and other countries setting up carbon trading
I think
schemes.
you'll
There's a
find
giant one in Europe. So I'm just asking, are you going to advise them to give up their carbon trading schemes and go with your better policy, in inverted commas, of direct action?
So here we have the clash of civilisations tonight.
Here we have a question. I'm just asking for an answer.
And the first thing is, I would gently question whether you would say that the European system has been, for Europeans, a great success. They've had to revise. Thank you, Yanis. I'll take that as a comment, but a very good one. But each country has to determine their own system. In Australia, we've just had 2 fabulously successful auctions that have defied all of the predictions. But I'm deeply respectful of countries choosing their own system. Ours is working for us. The World Bank's adopting a model. The International Aviation Authority, IATA, is looking at our system. The UN Clean Development Mechanism is based on very similar lines to ours. And so what we find is that for us, the reverse auction is a pure market mechanism.
It does sound like, frankly, that you
will
will be a sort of disciple for this idea. I mean, it's clear that you think it works better than carbon trading.
Well, there are 2 fundamental schemes in the world. There's a carbon trading scheme, or there is a reverse auction scheme. Both are versions of market mechanisms. Undoubtedly, there is more and more effort being put into and looking at the reverse auction model because it simply targets emissions reductions directly.
Geraldine, are you convinced? This is a system that Australia has adopted. Greg Hunt has the runs on the board if he's going to come out with figures saying we're below our targets for 2020.
If we're below our targets, we better get some more ambitious targets pretty quickly because this is an urgent predicament, and this fragile continent will suffer greatly. And people say we can't afford to do this and that. We cannot afford not to do it because, Wall Street will be underwater and there'll be no viable economy if we don't get serious about addressing this. It's wonderful that we're going to Paris, that we're taking these leadership roles, but at the same time we're contemplating opening the Adani coal mine, the biggest coal mine ever, at a time when we should be looking at renewables. We've cut investment in renewables by 80% last year. That puts us down somewhere like Myanmar. I don't think that we're taking the leadership role that we're capable of taking.
I better throw back to, and keep it brief if you wouldn't mind, but can I just make the point that one of your ministerial colleagues, I think, said that exporting Australian coal is actually going to bring down emissions.
Well, I think
Do you take that view as well?
I actually met with the former head of the Indian Foreign Ministry last week, who was their climate ambassador, Shayan Saram, and he's a very sophisticated, intelligent person. And what he was saying to us is, we're going to massively increase our renewables as a country as we bring people out of poverty. We're also increasing our nuclear. We're also increasing our conventional fuel. Electricity is the fundamental. He said, if we weren't using Australian resources, we would be using higher sulphur, higher emissions resources, which wouldn't allow us to go to what are called supercritical or ultra supercritical plants. So this was from perhaps India's foremost expert.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to throw to Anthony Albanese
help
just to get
reduce
his
emissions.
response.
But above all else, they're massively increasing their renewables.
Yep.
But at the same time, what we're doing is making sure that they can bring people out of poverty and do it in as low emissions way as possible.
Anthony Albanese, our coal's better than their coal.
Well, an accounting trick is not a substance for real action. And the fact is that the only reason why Australia will meet its target is because of the discount that's there for Kyoto 1, which allows for the fact that emissions were decreasing substantially under the former Labor government with an 8% decline. Emissions are now increasing. Under this so-called direct action plan, 72% of the first lot of the auction of $650-odd million, I think it was already existing projects. It was just giving money to the big polluters to keep doing exactly what they are doing already. 10% of it for AGL alone, Australia's biggest polluter. This is, you know, we talked before about Judith spoke about defending markets and who's in favour of markets. They were climate skeptics under Tony Abbott, now they're still market skeptics. And if you want proof of Greg's credentials, I mean, did everything to keep Tony Abbott there, and they still adopted Tony Abbott's policies. They're still exactly the same. And Greg has to answer what changes there have been, given that Malcolm Turnbull, clearly for years, called this policy a fraud, but he's going along with exactly the same policy. I'm just going to,
once again, just go to The Economist. Judith, would you prefer to see a market-based system, or do you agree with Greg Hunt, that market-based carbon trading scheme, I mean, or do you agree with Greg Hunt that his system of direct action is, in fact, at heart, a market-based system?
Well, you know, none of them are markets, actually. They're contrivances. They're set up through regulations. So we kind of got to be a bit careful with the language. The idea that an emissions trading scheme is somehow superior to a reverse auction, that's not true. They're all contrivances, right? And so basically the question you ask is, what is the economic cost associated with given reductions in emissions? Now, what you said before, Tony, was not true. I mean, America's not going to an emissions trading scheme.
Individual states are.
Russia's not.
California is, and it's bigger than Australia.
Yeah, but then they import the electricity from the dirty coal-fired power stations elsewhere. Russia's not going, India's not going, the European one has basically been a failure. This is, I mean, I'm absolutely with Malcolm Turnbull on this. You know, let us have an open mind about how you get there. The key thing that Paris will achieve, it will never achieve a binding agreement, by the way, because of Yanis's point, because we have no world government, right? So we will get a series of statements of intent about emissions reduction ambitions, and there will be an open mind about how countries get there. And that's really, I think, is as much as you can hope for.
I'm going to, sorry, Greg, you're going to have to make that point on another program. You're watching the final Q&A of 2015, but join Julia Baird on Wednesday for a special Q&A after hitting home Sarah Ferguson's two-part documentary on domestic violence. We've got time for just one more question tonight. It comes from Greg Black.
Thanks, Tony. Malcolm Turnbull is now out-labouring Labor in his focus on fairness, which is usually just code for continually growing the budget deficit, unfortunately. With the ascension of Malcolm and the appearance of a newer, cuddlier Scott Morrison, who in the government will fly the flag for fiscal responsibility and its individual counterpart reward for effort?
Greg Hunt.
Well, we all do, actually. And let me say...
Copying it from the right now.
Yeah, yes. No, let me say this, that a nation has to live within its means, and it also has to provide opportunity. And so when you look at the reforms, what are the big things that we're doing? The free trade agreements, and Judith talked about perhaps a lack of appetite for big reforms. These are never popular, but the free trade agreements with China and Japan and Korea, with the TPP or the partnership across the Pacific, these are all about creating jobs and opportunities, and it's very much a sort of modern free market approach. At the same time, always trying to reduce the burden of deficit. Under the previous government, they had $70 billion worth of income growth over the course of their period. They had $140 billion of expenditure growth. So that left a terrible legacy for future generations, because at the end of the day, somebody has to pay it back. So
Greg, there's going to be,
our message is very clear that we are going to have to work hard to continually cut the surplus.
We don't have time for a long history lesson, but many of those points which we've heard before on this program. So, but maybe you could just tell us, to cut to the chase there, how long Malcolm Turnbull can remain as a kind of benign cross between Gough Whitlam and Robert Menzies.
I think he'd probably be very flattered. He was friends with Gough, and he has great admiration for what Menzies was. He will make his own way as Prime Minister, and at the end of the day, it's about, you know, the big changes in terms of innovation, with an important package to come on that, in terms of fiscal responsibility and in terms of open markets, which are going to give people a chance to create businesses and to create jobs.
Okay,
that's what he's going to do.
We've got a little time for everyone to pick up on the Malcolm Turnbull point. I'll start with Tasneem.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure about that cuddly Scott Morrison thing. That kind of threw me. But in terms of fiscal, I guess, clarity and you know, just my understanding with the TPP is I'm very concerned about what I don't know. And I do feel that the secrecy clouding that, and I think that the silence about what we don't know with regards to this, and the kind of escalation of, you know, where will jobs from this country go, and, you know, who will the trading partners be, and the less we know, the more I'm concerned about it. And I don't believe that it's when governments keep calling everything, you know, national security or the people's best interests, it really riles me up.
Judith Sloan.
Well, I think I think it's a good question, but I think at the end of the day, Malcolm Turnbull has, I think, some very good instincts when it comes to economic management, fiscal management, where business fits in, the importance of work effort, the importance of creating incentives to invest and save. So I'm not precisely sure what they've got planned, but I'm actually reasonably optimistic.
Anthony Albanese.
I think the question's based on a falsehood. Tony Abbott doubled the deficit since he came into office. There's now higher unemployment than there was at the time of the change of election. Real wages and living standards are actually declining. And we have a circumstance whereby there's been a change of Prime Minister, but essentially the policies are the same. They've got legislation before the Parliament now that would hit, in terms of welfare changes, hit at the bottom end, whereas they won't touch, or haven't touched yet, the sort of measures that we've put forward on multinational taxation, on superannuation at the high end, putting some equity back into the system. I've seen no evidence yet of any substance in terms of change from Malcolm Turnbull.
Anthony, if what you're saying is right, just a very brief answer on this, but if what you're saying is right, why is he thrashing you in the polls?
Because he's all things to all people at the moment. He's saying, let's all just hold hands and say kumbaya. There is no... Even Judith.
It had to happen sooner or later.
And once the actual policies are out there, and that's why if he doesn't go... If he goes to an election early, it'll be because he wants to hide what he's got in the budget.
Which, I won't go to the GST, there's too much of an argument on that.
Well, and I didn't even mention that.
No, I know. Yanis, you know, you used to live here. You've seen what's happened here, the transition to a new Prime Minister, an astonishing change in the polls in particular, but also, some would say, in the vibe.
For good reason, I believe. Look, the question that Greg asked is pertinent. I was the finance minister of a bankrupt state, and you're quite right. A nation has to live within its means or it gets in trouble. But what does exactly that mean? There is public debt and there's private debt. If you look at the situation in Australia, the public debt in this country is minuscule compared to anybody else, all the other major industrial centers around the world. But you have a huge problem with private debt. More than 120% of national income amounts to your private debt. So in a country, especially due to the slowdown in China, where investment is trailing savings, there is an imbalance between savings and investment, which also has a current account deficit. In such a situation, such a macroeconomy, if the government speedily balances its books by being responsible the way you imply, then you will not be able to balance your books. Then the private sector is going to have to run an even larger deficit, and the only way, this is a truth of geometry if you want, of algebra, the only way you can prevent that is for the government and the private sector, households, people, corporations to balance their books, is if investment is picked up, investment to produce stuff, hopefully stuff that does not pollute the environment, that is not toxic. So this is why his instinct is right. Focusing on innovation that lifts investment to the level of saving so as to make it possible for the government to be responsible while you are responsible. And you are not responsible in this country. As individuals, as households, as corporations. You run too high a private debt. So he's right. Will he be able to do it? I think that, as I indicated before, he may have a problem with his own party. Maybe the optimal political solution would be Prime Minister Turnbull leading a Labour-Green coalition.
Geraldine, I'll give the final word to you. You watched the rise of Malcolm Turnbull from a distance. How does it look?
I haven't watched it from a distance. I went to Sydney University with him. I watched it quite close up, actually.
Oh, that was the early rise. I'm talking about more recently.
Oh, it's been a very constant trajectory, I think. You know, Malcolm has finally realised his lifelong dream to be Prime Minister. Now, it remains to be seen if he's got what it takes to help us realise ours.
That succinct answer is just what we needed to end the program because we are running out of time. In fact, we're over time. Please thank our panel. Tasneem Chopra, Greg Hunt, Geraldine Brooks, Yanis Varoufakis, Anthony Albanese and Judith Sloan. Thank you, and as I said, this is our final Q&A for 2015, so we'll leave you with Sammy J and Randy. They'll be appearing at the Sydney and Melbourne Comedy Festivals and Adelaide Fringe, but tonight they've got a brand new song to wrap up our year. Thanks for being part of Q&A. Till 2016, good night.
How you going, Randy?
Good, mate, good.
It's going to applause us then, but they didn't.
No.
They sat silently.
No
How you going, guys?
in.
Nice to see you. Oh, no, it's
don't patronise us now, it's too late.
Tony should have told you to applaud, then he would have done it. Randy, it's been a big year, huge
It's
year.
been a huge year. In the immortal words of our current Prime Minister, there's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Another year over, time to relax. Q&A made it without getting axed.
The audience members have all cleared security. Hashtags are being proofread for their purity.
And now Malcolm's in charge, Tony Jones will be fine. 'Cause there's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian. This song's been censored by lawyers. And we're contractually obliged to remind you that the opinions expressed within this song are not those of the ABC. And rest assured there's a verse coming up that also criticises the ALP. Because we don't want accusations of bias to adversely affect our chances of being invited back on TV. But there's never been a more exciting time.
The year started well for Prince Philip at least. Most of Australia thought he was deceased.
Until Captain Abbott declared him a knight. And even the Queen said,
"This doesn't smell right."
And Malcolm watched on with the polls in decline, thinking there's never been a more exciting time to be Malcolm Turnbull. Throw some more cash on the Barbie. Then the age of entitlement curled up and died
when Bronwyn dropped $4,000 on a ride
in a chopper that landed poor Tony in strife.
And the Minister for Women said to his wife,
"Darling, it looks like my job's on the line. And there's never been a more exciting time to go into hiding and sob in the fetal position. But we don't feel sorry for Abbott. Shorten's the one out of luck. He signed up to fight Captain Speedo and now has to fight Scrooge McDuck. But Malcolm, don't get too cocky, though the nation is under your spell. If you pause to peruse the statistics, then any backbencher can tell that historically speaking you should just resign, 'cause there's never been a less exciting time to be a Prime Minister. 5 in 5 years and you're next in line.
Leadership spills are a dozen a dime.
You or Bill Shorten, either is fine. We just love watching leaders get stabbed in the spine. So there's never been a more exciting time